Well, greetings, brethren. Happy Sabbath, and welcome to the Sabbath service for this 8th day of June 2024 on the Roman calendar. More importantly, and more eternally, the calendar that's going to exist forever after Jesus Christ returns and restores and ushers in and restores God's kingdom back to this earth. On that calendar, it is the second day of the third month. I know we have a small error on our calendar that's showing on the screen. I left the highlighting on the second month of Ziph when I should have changed that over to the third month of Sivan. And we're just into the second day of the third month on God's calendar. And we're only days away, just a week and a day away from the next holy day that we are counting to. Excuse me, brother. I've been having a little problem with my throat. I think it's from, I need to find some local raw honey because I think it's from allergens or pollens, pollens in the air that, you know, we all have a natural allergy to certain pollens, and God provided for that by making antipollens that the bees put into the honey for us, for the local pollens. And so to stay healthy, completely healthy, we have to eat some local honey. And you have to go out and find it, especially today. We don't have as many beekeepers. When people had local farms and things, you could always easily find a beekeeper who would have local honey. He'd be glad to sell you. And we fortunately, we do have that here in the area, but you gotta hunt them down, find them home, and go out and buy it. In the meantime, I'll just have to keep hitting my mic button and clear my throat once in a while. But I'm not going to be speaking very much this morning. Some of you may say, good, Steve, we'll take a break from you for a while. But we're going to sing a hymn, and we're going to go to a very special sermon that is entitled The Place of Safety, a term that we used to use pretty often for the place in the wilderness that God calls her place, the place he's prepared for his bride. And it's an old sermon by a minister who has deceased. He's died. He's sleeping. He's one of our sleeping saints. But he was a very faithful minister throughout his entire ministry, his entire career. He goes way back to at least 1966 when he gave a certain sermon that from Houston that we have a recording for this morning. And he goes back further than that, and he goes back to a time when he and Norman Smith and a few others, he wrote his in 1962. 4 years later, Norman Smith gave a sermon wrote a publication even on the place of safety, as we used to call it. And then Mr. Armstrong announced one day that, really that's not in the Bible. And he said that term is not in the Bible. It is a place of refuge for us. It's a place of nourishment for us. And, while you kind of maybe get tuned in, settled in, before we sing a hymn, I'm going to flip over in my Bible. If you want to go there with me, I'll have it on the screen in just a moment. I'm going to put Revelation chapter 12 and verse 14 up on the screen. All right, everybody got a good look at the calendar. We're, as of sunset tonight, like I mentioned in the Bible study last night, we're at sunset. We'll be at the end of 6 weeks of our counting. We just have one more week to go until the 7 weeks, the Feast of Weeks, are all over, and then we celebrate the day 50 that we're counting to as Pentecost. And that'll be the morrow after the 7th Sabbath. Next Sabbath will be the 7th Sabbath of the 7 Sabbaths that we've been counting. You see it on your screen. We've got the highlighting at the Sabbath. It's the 6th week of counting. The 6th Sabbath has the yellow highlighting for today's date. second day of the third month on God's holy sacred calendar, the 8th day of June, 2024, on the civil Roman calendar, a calendar that's going to be done away, as are all the civil governments as we know them today. All that's going to be done away when Jesus Christ returns. Hooray! And we'll have the restored government of God, where we won't have all this crazy politics, and we won't see war and fighting and all that stuff. Those that want to rebel, God will simply cut off their water. With no water, you don't have any food grows. No food, no water. Men lose their strength and energy, won't be able to fight. And that's the way God will punish. He'll do it with a sword where he would have to if we really had a real obstinate people. But you cut off their water, leave them without food, and they lose their energy. They suddenly have a real change of spirit. Some of the nations of this world should take note when there's a people that wants to kill another people, and those people that are trying to stop their enemy from killing them. So what if they get out of food for a little while? They'll get real hungry. They'll decide to change their attitude. They'll come forward and say, hey, we know where your real enemy is hiding, and we're going to bring him to you. And besides, if you send us food, those that are over us that are putting our lives at risk, they're only going to take that food away from us anyway. So you're really feeding your enemy. God only says give them water. So we could take note from the way God will deal. God already tells us how he'll deal with that in the future. To rebellious nations, he'll cut off your water if you refuse to come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And if you're acting worse than that, God does say he's going to rule with a rod of iron. And he will have the upper hand. He will not allow what nations today suffer, where one sends a few bombs and the other says, well, hey, help us get some bombs. We'll bomb them people back. We won't have that. God will definitely have the upper hand, and he'll be dealing with lovingly. He's already given his life for the world, and it is our Father's desire, as announced in 2 Peter 3, verse 9, that it's his will that none perish. I got to put that verse back up on the screen in a moment, because I keep forgetting. I thought I was going to remember whether it was 1 Peter or 2 Peter, but I do know it's chapter 3 and verse 9. But let's put this Bible display on the screen. As I mentioned, we wanted to look first of all at Revelation 12:14. But you know what? Because I might forget, we're going to sing a hymn together in a moment. Because I might forget, and I'd like to just get that small point out of the way, let's go take a quick look. We'll come right back to Revelation 12:14. Let's take a quick, and this is priming you and getting you ready for a fantastic, detailed sermon by Mr. LeRoy Neff that we're going to share today. But where did I say we're going to go? We're going to, first of all, check out which one I'm in. 1 Peter. That's not where it is. It is 2 Peter. And I did say 2 Peter first. So I actually had it, but I wasn't sure about it. But I'll pop it on the screen for a moment, because it does make a good point for us from 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. They tie together, really. Let's read them both. But, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. Something that helps us remember that, hey, even though it's been a long time since Mr. Armstrong died, Jesus Christ, God hasn't said, Christ, go ahead and return and restore the kingdom yet. That's not a lot of time to God. Mr. Armstrong died in 1986. We're just 2 years away from being a full, 40 years would that be? 86, 96, 2006, 2016, 2 years away from 40 years. So it's been 38 years since Mr. Armstrong died. That's a drop in the bucket to God when you consider this fact that time, relative to God, time is just a drop in the bucket. Even 1,000 years, just a drop in the bucket, because it can be like a day to God. Or a day can be like 1,000 years. With God, it's just different than it is with man. But in verse 9, this is got the main point I was making a moment ago. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise. So his promise is not going to fail. He's not aborting or abandoning his promise that Christ will return before mankind can annihilate all flesh from off this earth. He's still got that promise out there for us, but he's giving us grace. And as Mr. Carlton Smith said in a sermon from Santa Barbara back in 1986, he defined grace for us in the best way I have ever heard it. He said, grace is God giving us time to repent. And brethren, as many of you learn, as I've learned, we go through many years of the days, the annual festival of the days of unleavened bread. Year after year, we repeat that, and we find in between the Feast of Unleavened Bread from year to year, hey, I still have this sin I've got to work on getting rid of. Yeah, I've made some progress on it and some headway against it, and God, I hope you'll take note of that, but just got to help me further. I hadn't completely got rid of this sin yet. Now, hopefully, brethren, not too many of us are saying too much of that, because we're getting real close to a time that Mr. Neff is going to be talking about, which has been the main theme of the ministry God has given me, which you've heard me say a lot, but you're going to hear somebody else talk about it now, who goes back to having written an article about it back in 1962. And you are going to hear him say a lot of the things that God has me emphasize to you from this ministry about what's ahead of us in between the first 4 active seals now and the 5th seal. Between now and the beginning of the Great Tribulation, and those 30 days between the 1290 and the 1260. By the way, now, Mr. Armstrong had not revealed exactly what the 1335 was back at the time when Mr. LeRoy Neff was speaking. So there were things shortly before Mr. Armstrong died that were revealed to us that some of the old-timers did not know. And there are some things that God has given some of us that are still alive in the ministry in a detailed way that wasn't known. But the basics that you're going to hear, what we preach today, if there's anything that I say that you say, I hadn't heard that before from any other minister, well, you may not, because God may be giving that to you through me. But one thing for sure, brethren, that you will not hear is that anything you hear me say will be in contradiction to the basics that God gave us through Mr. Armstrong, that his faithful ministers shared with us, and that they studied to get, like Mr. Armstrong encouraged the ministry to do. When he would say, brethren, I have to give you the basics and the root of the tree, which is a lot. It's a huge root system. He says, and the more specific details, I leave it up to you ministers to search those out and give those to the brethren, which would not have contradicted anything Mr. Armstrong said. Mr. Armstrong would have shaken his head and said, yeah, you got it. Some of the things, though, would be preserved till we get real closer to the events happening. And as many of you know, and Mr. Armstrong has died, but God did not remove him in a spiritual sense. He died as our end-time apostle, and there was no replacement. There has been, in spite of some saying to the contrary that they are it. They are not. There has been no replacement of God's end-time apostle. God corrected all doctrine that needed to be corrected before Mr. Armstrong died. No one but an apostle can change doctrine. So the doctrine that God left us through Mr. Armstrong, that is the doctrine. Doctrine simply really means teaching, instruction, and the instruction as it was left with us as doctrine which is according to God's word also, there's no reason or need to change it. We clearly see where there was error, and we clearly see the correction to that error that God gave us through Mr. Armstrong. I'm alluding to the one as we count toward Pentecost that relates to keeping Pentecost on the first day of the week as it should be done, that we did incorrectly we didn't know how to count it for the first 40 years of the Philadelphia era. And another 7 years on top of that, Mr. Armstrong was observing Pentecost the way the Jewish people count it from the annual Sabbath, and God corrected us on that through Mr. Armstrong in 1937, that we should be counting it from, as we went into some detail last night in the Bible study. If you missed last night's Bible study, I encourage you during the break today, sometime during the Sabbath, go to our website at cogtv.org. You can get there by typing in sabbath.tv. It'll take you to cogtv.org. That's not a church group you can join or become a member of. That's simply the acronym for this ministry on our domain. Our domain website is cogtv.org, and that's what this ministry of Stephen Gilbreath, under the instruction and of God's end-time apostle Herbert Armstrong, that we continue without compromise. That's the website address. Acronym for Church of God Television. That gets you to our website where you can hear these live streams, and you can hear archive video of past live streams of Bible studies or Sabbath services. And on our other channel, we'll watch old news stories, and now I'm putting new news stories on there. So I'm doing it different. We're not doing a live stream with it at the moment. Maybe we'll get back to that, but with the new system of way things work, I just link the news story from credible news sources and make commentary about those news pieces. We're doing that now on worldwatch.tv. and on our World Watch page on Facebook, which is called World Watch TV, I think is what we call it there. But this verse I have on the screen, brethren, let's get the main point of it. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering, patient with us. That's why God's given us 38 years. Some of you and me have needed it to get sin out of our lives the way we need to. And if I were to ask you a question, just a rhetorical question, you don't have to answer it out loud or to the public, just to yourself. Have you found, from unleavened bread to unleavened bread, if you're really keeping it the way you should be keeping it, have you, brethren, not found that land sakes alive, I have needed this extra time God has given us. I still have this big sin in my life, or traces of it. I'm making headway against it, but boy, it still looms up on me. I'm tempted by it, and sometimes I still give in. Now, if you're answering that, if you're saying that to yourself, then you should be thanking God that he hasn't closed the door to that ark yet, because you wouldn't have been allowed to get on the ark. Now, I'm speaking symbolically. That refers to what Mr. Neff is going to talk about, that I've often talked about, related to Luke 21, verse 36, and you being accounted worthy to escape, and your escape being pursuant to what we're going to put back on the screen in a moment, as God tells us in Revelation 12:14, via two wings of a great eagle. And Mr. Neff is going to have a very humorous comment saying that some of you believe that's going to be Boeing aircraft. And you're going to hear him poo-poo the fact that that's absolutely what God is saying. He does go on and say that that could be it, but don't place your bankroll on that, or your life. He says, the God, like I've often said to you, he backs up a lot of what I've said to you, brethren, that God leaves himself certain options. And he's going to discuss whether the place of safety, and whether we should really be calling it the place of safety. Mr. Armstrong himself said, brethren, that's not in the Bible. He said we probably should be calling it a place of of nourishment. That's the way it's good. Let's go to Revelation 12 in a moment. Let me finish this verse. We'll put it on the screen where you can see what I'm talking about. Then we'll sing a hymn. Then we'll hear Mr. Neff give a fabulous, in-depth sermon on this subject that backs up a lot of what you've been hearing me saying. And you hear it in a thoughtful, well-paced, slow way as he carefully goes through it with you. And for those of you who've been poo-pooing some things I'm saying, you're going to hear an old, long-time evangelist backing me up in those things, going way back. And he gives the foundation for what God has built upon through yours truly here for you. That I appreciate, by the way, that some of the cards I've gotten from some of you and the writings and notes I've gotten to you from you privately and some posted publicly, that you appreciate what God's been giving you through this ministry He has me doing for you, and that you appreciate my part in that. I appreciate hearing that from those of you who've said that to me. Thank you very much. That's good encouragement, because God has let me go through some trials where in the past, I've actually prayed, God, okay, if you're through with me, you're letting me go through such a fiery trial right now. If you're through with me and you want to let me die, then, stop all this pain I'm in. Then if you're through with me, then it's okay with me. Let me die. But He wasn't through with me, and I think He wanted to hear what my attitude would be through it all. And I've stayed here, and as God said, I'm reopening this door for you. Just be careful with it. And I think many of you can take note or testify for me, or that I have been careful with this, and I'm diligently working it. Could maybe work it a little more diligently, and I'm taking vitamins and stuff for more natural strength. And it's amazing. I can be worn out when the Sabbath comes, and amazingly, every Sabbath God renews my strength, at least during the time when I need to be live streaming for you, brethren. I do need to go get me some honey to get rid of that pollen effect on my throat that occasionally happens. But let's move on. We got to sing a hymn, get to Mr. Neff. This verse has got the part here that it's not willing. He's long-suffering, patient with us, and for a purpose. It's His will, as He says right here. It's His will that none perish, not willing that any should perish. Now, some are going to be obstinate, even some who He's called, I'm sad to say, as other ministers have noticed, will just give up. And brethren, God's got a ministry here for you in hope that you do not give up, in hope that you be encouraged to persevere, as you're going to hear Mr. Neff say, that we don't just make it to Petra, and that's it. We got it made in the shade. He says, no, you can die in Petra. You can fall out of the faith while in Petra. Petra might even encourage, as he was putting, might encourage some of you. As he said, if in fact that's where we go. But see, some of the thinking in the past was limited to that area of Edom, Petra. For some reason, people localized on that, but the actual verse, Mr. Neff will refer to it, as I've often referred to you, Daniel 11, verses 40 and 41. He'll back me up on how that mentions, that's the only place in the Bible that mentions a place on the earth that's protected from the beast during the Great Tribulation. And so, for that reason, Mr. Armstrong said, and we see the narrow passageway at Petra that looks like, that reminded Mr. Armstrong of the time when ancient Israel had to traverse through the Red Sea. Now, here's that passageway between the rocks, and as Mr. Neff will point out, he's been there. I've been there personally, too. I rode camel through there. There's some places where it's only 6 or 12 feet wide between those big, tall rocks. In some places, it's a very narrow passageway. And when it chokes down to that short, that means an army pursuing you is going to be greatly slowed down at their ability to get their army through that 6 feet of space. to try to capture you. Very similar to how when Pharaoh's army pursuing ancient Israel had to get all that big army through the Red Sea. Now I've got a composite picture here that has the Red Sea in the front and a real picture of Petra and its narrow passageway in the back. And you see a graphic illustration of Moses standing there with his rod, but you see a narrow passageway between the Red Sea. And the army trying to get through there, they couldn't come with a wide run against you. They had to narrow into one long, narrow line of soldiers. That slows them down. Well, we'll have the same thing at Petra, narrow passageway. Now, I've locked in on Petra as the place where we get into Petra because that verse, there's no other verse in the Bible. Now, if God still has the option to say, yeah, Stephen, but I only said I'd take them to a wilderness. I didn't say exactly where I'd take them. But brethren, sometimes you got to read between the lines. And when you read between the lines, you've got to allow also for, hey, it may not be exactly like this. I'd have no problem if God decided to take us to a wilderness somewhere else. But I mean, listen, brethren, when you know God's mind, and when you pray for inspiration when you speak, and God says, okay, Stephen, I'm going to let you have this, and it'll prove out. But you also got to allow for the fact that I didn't actually say it and state it, but and if I left myself an option just in case the devil really pulled some freaky thing that I even didn't count on. I've got an option. I'm still more powerful than the devil, and will eventually put him away forever in a bottomless pit where he'll never have access to the family of God again, or to my throne, or any of that, God, and so, but in the meantime, God's got this wonderful mercy about him. When he puts somebody in an office, he leaves them there until somebody else qualifies to come and replace them, as Jesus Christ has done with the devil, and gave the devil an opportunity. But God proved he was greater than the devil, an opportunity to slack off of his rebellion against God. But he's got himself set in concrete as an enemy of God. But all right, I've got to hurry. We got to get to the hymn and get to Mr. Neff. Mr. Neff's going to cover a lot of what I might say right here. Let's go back to the Bible display and take a look at that verse. Let's switch it over to Revelation 12 and verse 14 where we were a moment ago, and let's go from there. So you can see this point, have it ready firmly in your mind, and so you really relate to what Mr. Neff is saying. You say, you know what, Stephen, Mr. Neff does provide the basics and provide the foundation and back you up in what you're saying. Of course, he got it from Mr. Armstrong, and many of you have also heard Mr. Armstrong say it, but Mr. Neff is doing an in-depth sermon on this, slowly, carefully, in depth, in the meticulous, studious way. He does it very effectively in a style that God has blessed him to have an ability and a skill with. That's helpful to us, brethren. And I hope you'll notice that and hear that when we play that sermon in a few minutes after we sing. But let's just take a look at this quickly. Revelation 12:14. Let's read it together. And to the woman, and as I've mentioned several times, Mr. Armstrong's pointed out that in prophecy, woman is the church. It can be either the true church or the false church. In Revelation 17 and in Revelation 13, we see a woman there picturing the false church. But here in Revelation 12, because of what God says in the previous verse, 13, because he persecuted the woman who brought forth the man-child, referring to Jesus Christ. We can see and clearly understand the woman here in Revelation 12, and especially right here, verse 14, is referring to the church that is God's true church. And to her, and you'll hear Mr. Neff say it in a humorous way. The two wings of a great eagle. Many of you have thought that's Boeing aircraft. He's kind of pointing out as he does that boomingly that God doesn't say that. But as Mr. Armstrong has explained, look, the Apostle John on the Isle of Patmos in 90 A.D., didn't have aircraft to refer to. The aircraft had not been invented when John wrote this. And Mr. Armstrong has positioned as saying, quite probably, what John was seeing in that vision was aircraft, modern aircraft. But he had no way to write. He didn't have the word aircraft, even if he did have the word. At the time he was writing it, nobody would have understood aircraft. What's that? So he called it two wings of a great eagle. But you're going to find the sermon, I believe, very in-depth in thinking, and it's going to challenge or wake up or add to your thinking. If you stay awake in this sermon, you're going to be thinking. Your brain's going to be put to some good work. But it says that we're flown into the wilderness. It doesn't say where exactly. Mr. Neff's going to make a reference to that. But when you look at Scripture and you see, well, there's only one Scripture that mentions a place that's protected during the Great Tribulation. And why would God mention that? Why would he mention that place is protected during the tribulation, but take you somewhere else? Duh. I'm just asking you to use a little bit of both human and spiritual logic and reasoning. When you see it in God's Word, you can apply even human reasoning to it, as long as you're also staying everything else in line with God spiritually. And you just say, God's logical, and he sometimes wants to tell you something without, like the parables. He doesn't exactly say it the way it really is. He tells you a parable, and then privately comes over later and explains it to only the disciples. Says, this is what the parable means. But I ain't letting the rest of the world know that. Somehow they'll read the Bible and they'll still miss it. As men who read the Bible still think they're going to heaven. The Bible don't say that. It talks about a resurrection. If people have already gone to heaven, why in the blooming world do they need to be resurrected? The Bible's got good horse sense in it, but people are blinded to it. Their eyes are so blinded spiritually, they can't even see it physically in many cases when they read it and just read right through it, because God's allowed that. He's allowed Satan to put blinders on the world. And when he explains that to us, it helps you understand, because you sometimes ask, how in the world can you look at this in the Bible, people in the world, and not understand it or preach something different than what the Bible says? But when you know that God allows the devil to put blinders on the world, and it's for a purpose, it's to protect men so they won't go to the lake of fire, so they can be called and have their minds opened later in a greater, big, colossal fall harvest. But it's a place where we'll be nourished. So Mr. Armstrong began to refer to it at times as a place of nourishment. And as Mr. Neff will mention, it was Gerald Waterhouse who kind of coined the phrase for a place of final training. And Mr. Armstrong, even though Mr. Waterhouse coined that, Mr. Armstrong liked it and would use that. I heard Mr. Armstrong use that in sermons a number of times, speaking of it being a place of final training. He would sometimes use numerous terms, as you've heard me do, where I'd say, brethren, we should want to be accounted worthy. And we should be, and that's not selfish, even though Mr. Neff will say we maybe shouldn't necessarily. God wasn't saying in Luke 21:36 that you expressly pray, God, account me worthy to escape, although Mr. Armstrong has said you can pray that. But what it means more so than that, you're going to hear Mr. Neff explain. As I've said many times, we're praying for the people affected adversely by the 4 seals that are active. We pray for them, and as we do that, we can understand that's why God accounts us worthy to escape, not because we've simply asked to be accounted worthy to escape, but because we're doing what God says to do, that brings into play the promise God made to us, that if you do this, I'll account you worthy to escape. And worthy, you'll hear Mr. Neff explain whose worthiness it really is that we're getting. It's Christ's worthiness that's being applied to us. That's why we're accounted worthy. We couldn't earn it to save our neck, but we do what we need to do that God says you got the right attitude. So I'm going to account you worthy. You're doing what I'm asking you to do. You're still a person in the human flesh. You don't have all of my Spirit. I'm giving it to you in a measure, and as you obey me, an even greater and greater measure. But, all right, before I take us away, a sermon, a subject I love, let's go to a hymn, brethren. And let's go to a hymn. You'll hear Mr. Neff, and I'll be able to pick up on Mr. Neff in other Sabbaths to come, and I think this is going to be good for all of us. And so let me put a hymn up on the screen and back it up to the beginning of the screen of the hymn. And I hope you're ready to participate in the service, to sing before the eternal great God, giving praise to Him who set aside this day for us to have extra special contact with Him, to have rest from work, and to be able to tell employers, we cannot work on this day. This is a day set aside where we worship God and we get in tune with Him in an extra special way today. We praise and thank Him for the calling He's given us, and even for this day of rest that He's given us. Let's sing praise to Him together, brethren, in Him together. Everybody from verse 1. All right, brethren, thank you very much to those of you who sang along on that. And we're going to go now to this sermon on a place of safety. And I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to put this graphic that is our graphic. Well, I've got this, whoops, I missed it there. I've got this picture of the narrow passageway at Petra. Well, I think I'm going to put the combination picture up there while Mr. Neff is speaking. Well, I may put this other graphic. Somebody else made it, but I better stay with our own graphics. And I'm going to slip out. I've listened to this sermon ahead of time, and I've listened to it many other times. And as I play it for you here, I'll be back toward the end of this. Just down the road from me is a funeral home where one of our elder brethren is having a viewing this morning during this service time. I'm going to be slipping away to that while I play this for you, and I'll be back, should be back right at the end of it. But here's the sermon now by evangelist LeRoy Neff, who is one of our sleeping saints awaiting the first resurrection, with what I consider to be a most outstanding sermon related to what we've often called the place of safety, and as he'll say, it's better worded by Mr. Waterhouse, Mr. Armstrong used it, place of final training, or as some of you've called it, a place of refuge. I've heard Mr. Armstrong use that term. But Mr. Armstrong did make reference to the scripture that from Revelation 12, verse 14, that mentions it's a place where God refers to it where she, the church, is nourished. So he therefore referred to it occasionally as a place of nourishment. And that is scriptural the way it's worded. But we also understand that since we're being protected there, it's a place of protection, it is a place of safety. Now, weathermen use it when tornadoes come, but, even though Mr. Armstrong backed off of it because he had some people complaining, that ain't in the Bible, and nourishment is, and protection, and so on. So he backed off of it, but it is a place of safety. But let's give a good listen now to this sermon that has been entitled, for Mr. LeRoy Neff's sermon, A Place of Safety. And I'll hopefully be back with you right at the end.
I'm sure that all of you have heard from other people in the church, especially those who have preceded you, who have been in the church for a while, tell you something like this. The church is going to flee to a place of safety 3.5 years before Christ's return. I won't ask how many of you have heard something like this, because surely all of you have heard about it. This particular subject is one that has generated much speculation and interest over the years, and has been, I'm sure, even before my wife and I came in the church, but it's been that way, we know, since 1951. And it was of great interest, especially to us in those early years. And some have said one thing, some have said another. Some in the church have said, well, we're not going to flee. We're just going to be protected wherever we are. Others have said, there is no place, but there are many places of safety. Others have said, well, it's just wherever the nearest mountain is. Of course, that leaves Texans in a little bit of a quandary, maybe. Others have said, and this is true because I have heard this from people who heard it with their own ears. One man who went to Pasadena from Houston, said that the place of safety was, guess where? Houston. So you've already made it. Later, though, this individual decided that he had made a mistake, and the next time he went to Pasadena, he said, no, that it was going to be Pasadena, California. I guess that's before it falls off into the sea. Others have said that the place of safety is going to be the area of ancient Edom, Moab or Ammon, and some have said that it is a place called Masada. If you don't know where Masada is, it's an interesting story to read about it, which I won't elaborate upon now at all. Others have said that it's Petra, which has sometimes, and rather appropriately, been called the rose-colored city of the dead. That sounds exciting, doesn't it? I remember in 1953, when we were going to make our first very long trip in the church from Oregon, Portland, Oregon, to, as we called it, Gladewater, Texas. And we've never been there. All we could do was look on the map and see where it was. And we thought, that's out sort of in a barren waste. There probably aren't trees within miles of there. Probably very dry, and so on and so forth. And, of course, we were rather surprised before we got there. We almost drowned on the way. Anyway, since we were going so far and our funds were rather limited for such a long trip, we decided to buy a tent. So we bought a 9-by-9 pyramid tent that would take care of my wife and I and our 3 children. And so when we got it all fixed up, we had wall-to-wall people. Anyway, when we bought this, we sincerely thought, we may take this tent to Petra. Well, I don't know what's happened to that tent. I know what we did with it. We used it for that 1 year, and that was more than enough. Well, we had great ideas, That place of safety was just around the corner, and we were all ready and raring to go. and that was in 1953. I suppose that tent by now has rotted, but I don't know, of course. I remember that some of us thought, some in the church thought, that we were going to flee to a place of safety in 1972. Actually, of course, some said we were going to do that in January of 1972 because, of course, the bombs were going to fall in 1972. And in case you didn't know when, the first week in January is when they were going to fall. I don't remember that happening, but at least some thought that that was the case. And there was one family that I heard about. In anticipation of the church fleeing to Petra, they were going to be sure that they were going to be there. And so what did they do? Well, they got their passports and they sold everything, I guess, and they literally moved to Jordan and were there in January of 1972. Now, I don't know if they're still there or not, but at least they were at that particular time. What's happened since then, I don't know. But I imagine they're rather disappointed because the church didn't go there to meet them. I presume they thought that they would be the first ones in Petra, and they'd be able to greet all the others when they arrived. I remember back around 1971, maybe 70, 71, 72, and I don't recall the exact times, that some people were saying, get your passports, because we're about ready to flee. And some were saying, get your silver coins, because the other kind will be worthless, and you'll need that in order to buy food and do this, that, and the other thing. I presume that some of you heard things along this line, and maybe you could tell some stories, too, about people and their plans and what they have done in regard to going to Petra or going to a place of safety. I remember many years ago, and this was back in the 50s, that a former business associate of Mr. Herbert Armstrong, who has long since not been associated with the work, but he was at that time. He wasn't employed by the work, but he was associated with the work in a very important way. But he was talking to another business associate. Now, both of these men were not members of the church. Since that time, one has become a member of the church, but at that time, neither of them were members of the church. But they were rather close to Mr. Armstrong because of the business association. And they were talking about this place of safety on one occasion, and so the one man said something like this to the other, or he was talking anyway about when we go to this place of safety. And this sort of startled the other man, I guess, and he relayed this to somebody else. He says, he thinks that he's going to go with us to a place of safety. Well, that was rather amusing to those that heard it, because they thought, well, now, here are all these people that aren't even members of the church and may never be members of the church as far as that's concerned, and they're doing this, that, and the other thing, which are contrary to God's ways, and they think they're going with us, to a place of safety. Now, just this past week, and I mean just this past week, a lady from one of the Houston churches called my wife. I didn't happen to be there at that particular time, and she asked, well, now, when we go to a place of safety, will my unconverted husband and son get to go? I don't remember now what my wife answered her, but I don't suppose she was able to give her a specific answer necessarily, because, of course, these things are, first of all, in God's hands, even though, of course, the Bible does give us some guidelines that might be of help along that line. But this indicates even the current interest in this subject. And I know that there are others that are scattered around that are talking about going to a place of safety, and that we're just about ready to flee, probably in the next few weeks, if maybe not the next few days. I sort of call this Petra fever. I hope none of you have it. Now, one reason why people get excited about this as far as a specific time is because they can count backwards as well as frontward, and they can count 1,260 days, 1,290 days, 1,335 days, or 3.5 years from when they think Christ will return. Now, there's only one catch to that. Nobody, and I mean nobody, knows when Jesus Christ is going to return. Now, I know God the Father does, and I presume by now Jesus Christ long since has found out, but you and I and all the rest of us on the face of this earth, none of us know when Jesus Christ is going to return. And so there can be quite a danger here, because we may make plans, we may say things, we may do things based on such a conclusion when that conclusion is not based on fact at all. Now, what does the Bible say about all this? Or does it say anything about it? Let me go back to the first statement that I read to you, that the church is going to flee to a place of safety 3.5 years before Christ returns. Now, I worded that very carefully because that statement is wrong on 3 counts. And you may think I don't know what I'm talking about, but I've studied the subject for a little while. You know, it's been interesting to me, too, over the last, 28 years. And so during that time, you know, I've read the scriptures that relate to this particular subject. Now, first, and you think that I don't know what I'm talking about when I state this, and then I'll show you in the Bible that this is true, but the Bible does not say that the church will flee. Now, you think I'm wrong in that. I'll repeat that. You may think that the Bible says that the church will flee. I want to show you that the Bible does not say the church will flee. And I'm going to be very specific. I'm going to be very exact to show you that. Now, secondly, the Bible nowhere refers to a, quote, place of safety, end quote. You can take those 3 words, place of safety, and you can look in your concordance, or you can read from the first verse in the Bible to the last verse in the Bible, and you will nowhere find the words place of safety. At least I haven't found it. Number 3, if or when the church goes to a place of safety, and maybe I should say if, because this place of safety now is a little bit of question as far as what we mean by that. But any going to a special place by the church must precede 3.5 years. And of course the Bible does mention a 3.5-year period that part of the church will be in a particular place. And we'll see that later. And so on 3 counts, that statement that the church is going to flee to a place of safety 3.5 years before Christ returns, in 3 counts at least, that is an incorrect statement. And yet I know those things are commonly believed by many in the Church of God. Now, what does God say? What does the Bible say? Don't be too sure that you know. And I hope that you will hear me out, and we'll go through those scriptures, and I may point out some things that you didn't notice were there. Or maybe we'll see some things you thought were there that weren't there. All right, now first, consider that there are 3 different but distinctly related events that the Bible speaks of relative to this subject. There are 3 distinct, and you might call it 4, distinct events that Bible prophecies tell us of. And sometimes people put all those 3 or 4 together. And no wonder they're confused. Now, let's turn to the book of Luke, chapter 21. Luke 21, and we'll be seeing this little passage more than once as we go through the subject, and so I will not cover all of the points at one time. Let's notice Luke 21, starting at verse 20. It says, "When you shall see Jerusalem compassed or encircled with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which were in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereunto. For these are the days of vengeance and the time of great distress," and so forth, as he mentions right after that. Now, another place where essentially the same thing is given is over in Matthew 24. And this might be a little more familiar, but let's turn there. Matthew 24, starting in verse 15. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso reads, let him understand. Let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take out anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And then again he mentions how extreme these conditions are going to be. And then in verse 21, maybe I should read verse 20. "But pray you that your flight Notice this word flight, and we're going to see the word flight and flee in several particular scriptures here and also in the book of Revelation. So he says, but pray that your flight be not on the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulation, and so on and so forth. All right, now I want to emphasize certain things here. Number one is that it speaks about those in Judea. Now, where are you? You're in Houston, Texas. This is talking about people in Judea. Now, do you know where Judea is from the Bible point of view? It's not Pasadena, California. It's not Houston, Texas. It's over in an area presently called the nation of Israel, where the city of Jerusalem is located. Jerusalem, Israel. That is in the ancient area of Judea. This is a specific, pointed prophecy for people in Judea. Now, if you're in Judea at the time this prophecy is being fulfilled and this flight is supposed to occur, then you're told here what you ought to do. And it's called a flight. Now, what does the word flight mean? If you look up in the Greek and then look up the meaning of the word, you'll find that the Greek word for flight here is phuge. We would spell it, I suppose, Phuge. And it literally means fleeing, or escape, or flight. Now, by flight, here is not talking about flying in the air. Totally separate from that meaning. But you do realize that the word fleeing can mean flight, and not necessarily be talking about flying in the air. I want to make that distinction because we're going to see another word when we come to the book of Revelation that is very different from this word. So here the word has to do with fleeing, escaping, or a flight. Not going up into the air, but fleeing, on the surface. Or, for that matter, it's just not implying one way or the other, but at least it's not emphasizing flying at all. Maybe a flight might be by air, as far as that's concerned, but when you read the account here, I think very obviously that's not the kind of flight or fleeing that he's talking about. Now, this particular flight, or this fleeing, if I can use that term, comes after a specific sign. And this sign, of course, is for those in Judea at that time to flee for their lives. And it's a very, very sudden thing. Now, we'll come a little bit more to this later because there are two phases of this. This particular prophecy is, in a sense, a twofold or a dual prophecy. Not in its entirety, but at least in a general way. Now, I'd like to go back now and recount to you just very briefly some of the events that took place between 66 and 70 A.D. That's in the first century. This was, roughly, 35 to 40 years after the finish of Christ's mission, his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension to heaven, the establishment of the church. So about 35 or 40 years later is the time that I have reference to. At that time, there was an uprising or rebellion on the part of the Jews, and there were various sieges and wars throughout the land of Palestine at that particular time where the Romans, under various of their generals, first one and then another, were quelling this rebellion and putting down their opposition. But it ended finally in the Roman armies under Titus, who was at that time then the son of the Emperor Vespasian, who had been the previous general there before he had been made emperor. Anyway, he took completely the land of Palestine, and those who were left after the sieges and after the war and so on were taken into captivity, literal captivity, and removed from that particular land. Now, a very interesting event took place as far as the Church of God is concerned. And the only source that I know of that recounts this is from a Catholic source. It's from the writings of a man by the name of Eusebius, who lived during the time of Constantine in the 4th century. And here is an exact quote now. Of course, this is translated into the English from the original Greek or Latin, whatever it was written in. And here is the exact quote now of what he said. He said, "But the members of the church in Jerusalem," and he's talking about the true church, which he was not a part of, but maybe he didn't realize that, I don't know. They thought, that they were an extension of that same Christianity. He says, "But the members of the church in Jerusalem were instructed by a prophecy revealed to the leaders to abandon the city before the war and to take up residence in one of the cities of Perea, which was named Pella. End of quotation. So here now is a historical account of how the church at Jerusalem removed and went to a place called Pella, P-E-L-L-A. If you have a map of Bible times, particularly during the time of Christ, you can look for the province of Perea, and you might be able to find the little town of Pella. It's up north of the Sea of Tiberias or the Sea of Galilee. Now, in the next paragraph, continuing this particular account, Eusebius said, and here's an exact quote again, that they migrated to Pella. They migrated to Pella. He didn't say they fled for their lives. He just said they migrated. Now, when did they, quote, migrate, end quote? If it were early in the period that I just mentioned, from 66 to 70 A.D., they would have arrived in Pella before the Roman armies swept across that particular area, and they would have been captured by the Roman army, because the Roman army went across there, it captured all the people, destroyed the city, as best I recall, and so on. Now, if it would have been late in that period, 66 to 70 A.D., after the Roman armies had gone over Pella and captured Pella and so on, then they would not have been harmed. The thing that I would like to emphasize here is that if those people would have gone too early, they would have been either killed or taken captive. But if they went at the right time, they could have received protection and would not have been harmed at all by the Roman army, by the invading Roman armies. Now, there's a rather remarkable account that you'll read in the book of Josephus, and those of you who like to research these things, you may want to write down where you'll find it in the book of Josephus, in the book of the Wars, book 6, chapter 5, and section 3. This is book 6, chapter 5, section 3. He, in that particular section, recounts several very remarkable things that took place during this period that I have been referring to, from 66 to 70 A.D. And one of those remarkable events that took place was the following. There was the sound of a great multitude in the temple. This is a miraculous thing now. It wasn't that there were a lot of people there, but the sound of a great multitude in the temple, which said, quote, "Let us remove hence," end quote. Now, this is an exact quote from the Whiston translation. "Let us remove hence," end quote. Now, this occurred, he said, on the day of Pentecost. He doesn't say the year, but probably it was 69 A.D., because by the following Pentecost, Jerusalem was already in its final death throes with the Roman armies surrounding the city and besieging the city, and finally many of them died by starvation, by famine, by disease, and also ultimately by the Roman armies, and then those who were left were taken captive and made slaves, literal slaves. So probably it was in 69 A.D. on the day of Pentecost. And some believe, and this seems very reasonable, that the leaders of the church were aware of this, and they realized that this meant now that they should go to a different place, because they realized that the destruction of Jerusalem was near, which it was. It was just a little over a year away. And then the prophecy you find here in Matthew 24 in its former fulfillment, which is not complete in every detail, but there is a former fulfillment, at least in a general way, of these things. And so they realized that they had to leave there, because armies did circle Jerusalem, as we read over in Luke's account. And then after that, they very surprisingly withdrew. And it was about 4 years, a little less than 4 years, before the final assault came on Jerusalem, and then it was impossible to escape. But after the first circling of Jerusalem and withdrawal, then God's church could leave, which they did. Now this migration, and I'm using now the words of Eusebius, this migration was not an emergency flight as described in the Olivet prophecy that I just read to you. Now, obviously, as you read this account in Matthew and also in Luke, you'll see that it's talking about a very urgent emergency exit and flight. And that particular event is yet to occur to God's people in Judea. Not Houston, in Judea. So there will yet be an emergency flight where when this sign is seen that God's people there, however many there are there in Jerusalem at that time, whether few or many, when they see this sign, the abomination of desolation set up in Judea, the abomination, it's not talking about an abomination being set up in Pasadena, California, or Tucson, Arizona, or Houston, Texas. It's talking about one in Judea that you can see with your own eyes. Now, at that time, God's people who realize that and see this, they aren't even supposed to go back in the house to get a coat. They're not even to go back into the house, to get the wife and the children. That's what it says. A very, very serious, urgent emergency when those people there will flee for their lives. And that will be a flight in the sense of a fleeing. But that's not talking about the church in quotes, it's not talking about the whole church. That's just talking about the people in Judea. If it were to happen today, I don't know how many people that would involve. A dozen, 2 dozen? How many it'll be at that time, I don't know, of course. All right, so that is a second fulfillment of an event that is related, you might say, to the subject of fleeing to a place of safety. Now, let's go to the book of Revelation next. The book of Revelation. And surely you know the chapter that I'm going to turn to, the chapter 12. Chapter 12 gives us a very long prophecy, starting with events that took place even before, apparently, Adam was created. And Mr. Armstrong has emphasized and talked about this a great deal, so I won't. It's not helpful as far as the subject of today is concerned anyway. But it mentions about this man-child, referring to Jesus Christ, we understand very clearly. And this is mentioned in verse 5. And then it says that he was caught up unto God and to his throne, speaking of Jesus Christ and his ascension to heaven, almost 1900 years ago. Now, in verse 6, we find events that follow that. Back at that time, or I'm speaking very broad generalities now, it's not talking here about the end time in the way that we think of the end time. And the woman fled into the wilderness. Now, here, the word fled is from the same basic root word as we saw back in Matthew 24, verse 20, where a person flees into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared of God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And then there was war in heaven. Now, a great deal of time is involved in what we see here in verse 5, verse 6, and verse 7. It says now that this woman, and the woman, of course, very obviously represents the church, flees into the wilderness. Now, the word wilderness, if you look it up in the Greek, is the word eremos. E-R-E-M-O-S, we would spell it in English, which means literally desert, or a solitary or a lonely place. And notice that it was a place prepared of God. And notice that it was for 1,260 days. But in prophecy, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you can apply the statement you'll find in Numbers 14, verse 34, of a day for a year. And in this particular case, that's exactly what it's talking about. It's not talking about 1,260 literal days. It's talking about 1,260 years. Over 1 millennium. Over 12 centuries it's talking about here. Now, how was this fulfilled? Obviously, it had to be fulfilled before now, because the war in heaven in verse 7 and the events that follow that, I think, very obviously, are events of the very end time. It's not talking about the events of 70 A.D. or 100 A.D. or 200 A.D. or 300 A.D. or any time like that. It's talking about the very end. And so between the time of Christ's ascension and the end time, there is a period when the church is going to flee into the wilderness for 1,260 literal years. Let me give you a little history of this time, and it's very brief, of course. There were various persecutions against the true Christians, and for that matter, even against the false Christians for quite some period of time. But the persecution against God's people was especially severe during the reigns of the Roman emperors Diocletian and Galerius, and particularly during the years of 303 to 313. Now this is, you see, 3 centuries after the time of Christ, after the church was established, approximately. And those particular years are called, if you'd like to write this down, you can read it later, in Revelation 2, verse 10. Revelation 2, verse 10, where it speaks about the 10 days, talking of a time of very severe persecution. Now that was 303 to 313. But the next emperor that came along was Constantine, and Constantine, of course, is very, very well known in so-called Christian history, because he supposedly saw a vision when he was on the battlefield, and this vision was that of, what was it? Seemed to me a sword and a cross. I'm not sure, but it seemed to me that's what it was. And then the words, what was it, in hoc signi vince, or something like that, under this, with this sign, conquer, or something like that. And so he, who was a pagan, thought, well, now here is God telling me that I should go forth conquering with the cross and the sword as my symbol, which he did. And so he then, in a sense, accepted Christianity, and then from another sense he did not. He was not, quote, baptized, end quote, by that particular church until he was on his deathbed. And so during the most of his life, you see, he wasn't, quote, a baptized Christian, end quote, from any point of view you might want to include. But in 325, Constantine, because of the bickering between various schisms and elements of the so-called Christian church at that particular time, ordered the Council of Nicaea. And he had all of these prelates, all of these bishops, the leading bishops and so on of the Catholic Church at that particular time, come together to decide certain basic things, and he was not so concerned about what they were going to decide, but they had to decide certain major issues. And it didn't matter to him, whether they were decided one way or the other. But they had to decide one way so that everyone was going to do it that way. And so following that, the Christian religion, which was not the true Christian religion, but really the false Christian religion, became the state religion. And that meant that other religions, especially including the true Church of God, were not able to continue to fully obey God and put in practice their beliefs and still do it in the centers of worship, the centers of power, the metropolitan areas, the city areas of the Roman Empire. And so what did they have to do following 325? If they wanted to obey God, if they wanted to practice the true Christian religion, they had to flee from the centers of influence of the Roman Catholic Church and of the Roman Empire into less populated areas. And in the earlier periods of this particular exile, I think you could call it an exile, they were most numerous in what we would call today Eastern Turkey. In later centuries, they were scattered in other areas in Europe, particularly in the mountains and in the mountain valleys, still away from the major centers of power and influence of the Roman Catholic Church and the Roman government. Now, as you come ahead, 1,260 years, around 1585, a rather strange thing happened in England. Prior to this time, the Catholic Church had dominated England and also the throne of England. And then starting with Henry VIII, and surely you all know about Henry VIII, he decided to kick the Roman Catholic Church out, and it's rather amusing as to why he kicked them out. But then following his death, it was sort of touch and go for a while, and they were sort of in and out of power depending on who the king or the queen was. But around 1586 to 1587, with the conviction and the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, this domination ended. And this also ended the 1,260 years when God's people had to, in a sense, flee from the influence and the power of that great church. But following this time now, the church was able to, again, be more public and also be in central areas. Where previously the Church of God could not flourish, in most cases, or even exist in the more populated areas of Europe and Asia, where the Catholics had power and influence and so on, or for that matter, maybe even in some of the Protestant areas following the time of Martin Luther and others. But now, after that 1,260 years, the church no longer had to continue on under those very stringent, difficult circumstances. So that is what it is talking about here, a historical thing that has long since passed in Revelation 12, verse 6. That is the third event that relates to the subject of, quote, fleeing to a place of safety, end quote. Now, let's go on a little bit further in chapter 12 and pick up the story in verse 13. But I might say now that in the interim, verse 7 through verse 12, of course, is telling about the war between Satan the devil and God and his angels, and finally Satan the devil was cast out, and then it mentions that the people in heaven, the angels in heaven is what it's talking about. Those in heaven could rejoice, but woe to the inhabitants of the world, of the earth, and of the sea, for the devil has come down having great wrath, as it mentions in verse 12. Verse 13, and when the dragon saw that he was cast under the earth, and of course the word dragon here is defined in verse 9 as the devil, Satan. He was cast under the earth. He persecuted the woman. Now, later, there's a war. You might notice that. We'll get a little ahead of the story in verse 17. But to start with, he persecutes. Later, he really makes war. So, if you think things are kind of bad now, when he is persecuting the church, wait till he starts to make war with the church. Now, in a sense, there is a war already going on. And that warfare, of course, has been going on all the time, not just since he was cast down. There are various scriptures that relate to that, I think, particularly in the 6th chapter of Ephesians, where we're told to put on the whole armor of God to fight in this particular war. So anyway, he persecutes the woman. Now, when does this happen? It happens after the church had gone into the wilderness for 1,260 years, and now, many centuries later, Satan is cast down. He persecutes the woman, and after that time now, what happens? This is the point now. We have come now to the point that people talk about all the time, but they confuse it with what we've already read. And those are different events. Prophecies of totally different events, even though obviously they're related, there are certain similarities. Now, what does it say? We're getting now down to the conditions as they are today, when Satan is persecuting the woman. And the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time, and half a time from the face of the serpent. Now, the time, and half a time, I think, is commonly understood by many Bible scholars, not just the Church of God, to indicate 3.5 years. So 3.5 years that this takes place, or if you count days, it's 1,260 days. Or if you count months, it's 42 months. But let's notice certain things now about this event that are different from those events that we've been reading about. He mentions here, to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle. Now, that didn't happen back in verse 6. It didn't happen in the events that I read to you of A.D. 66 to 70, probably 69. This is talking about a yet future event. Given 2 wings of a great eagle. And I'll comment a little bit more about that point a little bit later. Then he mentions that she might fly into the wilderness. Here, the word is not fuge that we saw before, or derivatives of that particular word. It's not the same as the one we saw in verse 6, where the woman fled. There, it is the same, it comes from the same root, fuge, as we saw in Matthew 24, verse 20. There, the word was flee, or fled. And in that sense, it was a, quote, flight, end quote, but it wasn't talking about flying in the air. But now when we come to verse 14, that she might fly, the word here in the Greek is pedomai, and I'm sorry I'm not a Greek scholar. I probably pronounce some of these names horribly. So if you're Greek scholars, I hope you'll forgive me. But the word literally means to fly. That means to go up in the air and fly, whether or not that's a flight from the point of view of fleeing or not. It isn't talking about fleeing, it's talking about flying. Now, do you know the difference between fleeing and flying? Well, then you can understand that this is a different situation, that she might fly in the wilderness. And it mentions in the wilderness to her place. Now, it doesn't say Petra, it doesn't say Masada, it doesn't say Houston, it doesn't say the mountains of Colorado. It says to her place. Now, where is, quote, her place? I'll comment at quite some length about that in a little while. Then notice another thing that says she is nourished. She is nourished. And maybe I can comment about that a little bit later too, but it's surely talking in a physical way and also in a spiritual way. Following that, and I won't read the other details in verse 15 and verse 16, but in verse 17, the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with a remnant of her seed. Now this shows that there were others of the church who were not able to fly into her place. Some were able to fly into her place, and some were not able to fly into her place, who were of the church of God, which he goes on to tell. They're the ones that keep the commandments of God and so on. All right, so have you seen any differences between this and what we've read previously? Have you seen anything different here from what the common conception is that we're going to flee to a place of safety? The words place of safety aren't here. It doesn't say that it's a safe place necessarily as far as that's concerned, or that it's a dangerous place. It just says that it's her place. All right, now I would like to answer some of the obvious questions. Who, what, where, when, how, etc., that sort of thing. I usually try to answer them in the sermon so that to anticipate any questions that people might have. Now first, who are the ones who are going to fly into her place? Who will go? I think very obviously, as I've already shown you, not all of the church. Verse 17 makes that clear. A part of the church. How much? 50%, 30%, 10%, 1%, or 99%? I don't know. So not all of the church is going to fly to, quote, her place, end quote. Now, who will? Well, to use words that we'll find over in Luke, chapter 21, verse 36, those who are worthy. Let's turn back there. Luke 21 and verse 36. Luke 21, verse 36. Just the last verse, and maybe we'll have time later to read the rest of this short passage. Watch you therefore and pray always that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. Now here he talks about escape, but escape where? Now we'll see a little bit more about that later. But anyway, he says here that those who are accounted worthy, whatever that means, and I'll elaborate on that shortly, are worthy to escape. And some obviously are, and some obviously are not. Does this include unconverted relatives, unconverted parents, unconverted children, friends, neighbors, employers? Well, I'll let you answer that question. It just says that some are going to be accounted worthy and some are not going to be accounted worthy. And I wouldn't like to elaborate very much about that, but I think obviously it doesn't include everybody. Let's turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 3. Revelation, chapter 3. This particular passage that I want to emphasize relates to the church of Philadelphia. And I'm sure all of you realize that this work, this church, is the Philadelphia era, if that's the proper term, that is talking about here. But that doesn't mean now that everyone who comes in the meetings of this particular church, everyone who sits in services, is really, shall we say, a Philadelphian. Some of them don't have that brotherly love that Philadelphia implies. Some of them don't have the characteristics that are described here. Some of them have the characteristics of the Laodicean church. Some have the characteristics of the Sardis church. And I won't elaborate on that because that would require another sermon. And so just because you're with the Church of Philadelphia doesn't mean that you're even converted. You might be just as converted as the jackrabbit is, as far as that's concerned, and still come and be in our services. But there are some that are doing what Philadelphia is supposed to be doing, and it tells a little bit about this. They have the attitude of Philadelphia, and so on and so forth. And those are the ones that we're talking about right now. But let's notice now, particularly verse 10. Because you, speaking of Philadelphia, because you have kept the word of my patience, or you have been patient in the time of tribulation and trouble, I will also keep you from the hour of temptation, or sometimes translated trial in other translations, the hour of trial which shall come upon all the world to try them that dwell upon the earth. Now some claim, of course, that these various churches that are mentioned here are not church eras. Of course, they are historical churches that existed in the first century, but there are other meanings of these words as well. But when was the hour of trial that came on the whole world back in the first century? There wasn't any such time. This is talking about the end time. You know, our time even in yet a little bit future. We don't know exactly when. An hour of temptation or an hour of trial that's going to come on the whole world. I won't turn there, but you might want to write down the scriptures, chapter 17, verse 12, where it mentions that these 10 are going to give their strength to the beast for 1 hour. Now, that's not the exact words, but I won't turn there to save time. Then, if you look and compare that with chapter 13, verse 5, you'll see that 1 hour is 42 months. So this is talking about an hour or 42 months or 1,260 days of trial. Wow. I don't know if that's me or it. Anyway, that's going to come on the whole world. Bet you can hear me now. All right, so we see then that Philadelphia is going to have divine supernatural protection from the events that are going to come upon the whole world. So obviously it's talking about the same thing we saw in chapter 12, when the church is going to fly to, quote, her place. Now this hasn't happened yet, but it's going to happen around about the time of the greatest trouble that's ever going to come on the face of the earth. So I hope I've answered that question a little bit as to who will go. The Philadelphia church, those who are, quote, worthy, end quote, and I'll say more of that later. In fact, that's the next thing I want to elaborate on. Who are those who are, quote, worthy, end quote? Let's turn back to Luke 21, and this time, again, notice verse 36. Luke 21 and verse 36. Watch you therefore and pray always that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. Notice it says, watch therefore and pray always. Now some think that this means you have to pray you'll be accounted worthy to escape. And it sounds like I'm varying up and down here again. Must be having trouble with our sound system. Anyway, there are 2 points I want to emphasize here. One is that you have to watch. What do you watch? Well, you watch world events, the fulfillment of prophecy. You watch also to see what's going on in the spirit world, the satanic activities of Satan and his demons. You watch the activity in the world that affects the church. You see what's going on. You're very watchful of everything, not just reading the newspaper once in a while, but continually watching world events, seeing what's going on in the world and in the church, and so forth, and see how those things are start fulfilling prophecy, so you will understand what's going on, what's behind it, and what's maybe next, at least in a general way. And secondly, those praying always, not praying, God save me. God save me from this trouble that's coming. Not just asking God to save your skin, but what should you pray about? Well, there are a lot of things to pray about, more than just praying for your own skin. That should be maybe about the last thing you ought to pray about. You ought to be praying about the world and a lot of other things. Praying always that we might escape. Now, I'd like to emphasize that just a little bit more, and that is that some who may think that they're going to escape to a place of safety may not be praying always. Because I've observed that sometimes those who think, well, I've got an in, I'm going to make it, I'm going to go, and so forth and so on, they sometimes neglect prayer. And if you're neglecting prayer, how can you expect to, quote, be worthy, end quote? It's not by knowing exactly what to do and when to do that's going to make it possible for you to go to, quote, her place. God will make that possible depending on those who are, as we see here, watching and praying always. Let's go a little bit further. How can we become worthy? Not just by watching and praying. That's an important part of it as far as that's concerned, but we all make mistakes, we all sin, we have all sinned in the past. We have to have the forgiveness of our sins. We have to have the sacrifice of Christ to clean us up. And it's really He that makes us worthy. But He's not going to make us worthy unless we do our part, unless we repent of sin, unless we ask forgiveness of sin, unless that sin is removed. And unless that doesn't happen, we're not going to be, quote, worthy, end quote. Because it's His worthiness, not our worthiness. Now, let's turn to Matthew 24 again, to verse 45, to see another point of how we can become or be worthy. Matthew 24. In verse 44, he says that we should always be ready. Be you also ready, for in an hour that you think not, that's when Christ is going to come. It's not when you think He's going to come. And some think they know, but they don't. Who then is a faithful and wise servant? Now, you could apply what he says here to the ministry, or maybe the leadership in the ministry, but we can apply it to every single one of us as well, brethren, because it's not the foolish who are going to go to a place of safety, and we could, if we had the time, maybe go over the early part of chapter 25 that talks about the foolish virgins and the wise virgins. Do you think those foolish virgins are going to be protected? I don't think so. The wise will. Now, who are the wise? Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his Lord has made ruler over his household? God has given each one of us certain responsibilities, certain rule. Maybe not over a church, maybe not even over a family, maybe just over ourselves, if we're single, or a family, if it's a husband or a wife. But God has given us collectively a very great responsibility, and that is to preach the gospel to the world as a witness. And also, as far as the ministry is concerned, to feed the flock, and each one of us have a part in that as well. But who then is the wise, that faithful and wise servant whom his Lord has made ruler over his household, to give them meat in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he comes, shall find so doing. Now, the thing I want to emphasize here, brethren, is that each one of us has our part in, quote, giving meat, end quote, in feeding others. Maybe we think that our responsibility is just to feed ourselves, just to take care of ourselves, just to satisfy ourselves, just to do our own thing. God has given each one of us a very great responsibility to do our part, whatever that is, in preaching the gospel to the world as a witness. Now, we all can't be the broadcaster. Mr. Armstrong is. We can't all be the writers of the various publications. We all can't be ministers, feeding the church and feeding the flock. But whatever our responsibility is, we had better be doing that. Now, for the membership of the church, of course, there is a multiple way that we can do our part, our tithes, our offerings, our prayers. You know, some people don't have any tithes or offerings. because they're unable to work because of physical circumstances, age, health, and so on, or maybe they have children. Our support of the church, whatever that might be, working hard to give more tithes and offerings to complete the job. But some fall down on the job. They quit. You see, God has given all of us, here's a tremendous job to do, and each one of us has our part. If we're not doing our part, to me, this scripture says, you're not going to make it, brother. You're not going to be accounted worthy. Because when Jesus Christ comes, and every time up until that, if you're not doing the job, what does it say he's going to say? Verse 47, verily I say unto you that he shall make him ruler over his goods, that is the one who is so doing. You know, the one who is giving meat, is giving spiritual food, doing his part in preaching the gospel and carrying on the work of God. But if that evil servant will say in his heart, my Lord delays his coming, and maybe some think that, maybe some think that he isn't going to delay his coming. But anyway, if he does various things here, then he is going to be, you might say, ultimately cast into a lake of fire. And here specifically he talks about those who are taking advantage of other brethren in the church, being evil and mean towards them and so on and so forth. I don't want to elaborate on that and get on another subject. But anyway, whatever our job is, God expects us to do that right to the very end. And if we're not doing that, if we're not giving meat, whatever our part is in doing that, how can we expect that we're going to be with God's church when they go to, quote, her place, end quote. Now, number 5, I'd like to turn to Luke 9 in connection with this. These are the ways now that we can be worthy. Chapter 9, verse 23 of Luke. And he said to them all, if any man will come after me, and supposedly all of us, or most of us at least, have decided I'm going to follow Christ now, I'm going to obey him, I'm going to do whatever it is he wants me to do, let him deny himself. You know, not do his own thing, but do my thing, God might be saying. And take up his cross daily. You know, not just for a certain number of years and then quit. And follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it. And brethren, surely we all, at one time or another, or maybe for a lot of times, I don't know, have been trying to save our own necks. I think that probably applies to every one of us in this room. I know it includes me. You know, some of us want a fire escape. It's not maybe the kind of fire escape that some people talk about in their Protestant religions, you know, and escaping hellfire, the kind of hellfire they're talking about. But I'm talking, you know, about an even hotter hellfire. And for some of us, you know, our basic motive, whether we may realize it or not, is to save our own skin. Now, it's not wrong to want to save our skin. You know, we all should want to do that as far as that's concerned, but for some of us, it's a rather excessive matter. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it. If you're in this to try to save your life, and that's your motive, and that is the basic reason for it all, you're going to lose it. But whosoever will lose his life, or you might say give it, for my sake the same shall save it. If you want to be saved, you want to give your life. And if you don't give your life to Christ and to his work and to the goals of this church, how are you going to save it? For what is a man advantage if he gain the whole world and lose himself, or be cast away, and so on and so forth? So, brethren, if you want to save your life, the best way to do that is to give it. And some of us haven't given our lives. You know, we're still wanting to do our thing, not God's thing. We want to do our thing. So I hope briefly those particular scriptures and those points will help you to understand how to be, quote, worthy, end quote. It is not easy. It's not just because your name is on the computer in Pasadena that is going to decide what's going to happen with you. Some people have made some comments along that line, and it's rather foolish. All right, next I'd like to ask, where is her place? We read that back in Revelation 12, quote, her place, remember? Where is that? Does this mean that the church will own that place, wherever it is? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe God has set aside a particular plot of ground somewhere, and maybe that's, quote, her place. I don't know. Or maybe it's a place that the church will own or will have at that particular time. We saw that it was in the wilderness, but remember, that's where the church went during those 1,260 years, and it wasn't clear away from everyone. It was away from the centers of population. It was away from the governmental areas. I suppose not only central government, but also provincial government and the like. Out in the hinterland, out in the less populated areas. So wilderness by itself, doesn't tell you exactly where it is. There are a lot of wilderness areas in the world. Now, possibly it's in the area of ancient Edom, in Moab and Ammon. Let's notice that in Daniel 11. Daniel 11. Now, this particular verse is not talking about her place. And I like to use that term rather than the term place of safety, because the word place of safety, or the term place of safety, is not biblical, is it? But her place is. All right, it mentions in verse 41 of Daniel 11, he, speaking now of this end-time king of the north, who will be the beast power of the United Europe, called the beast, of course, in the book of Revelation. He shall enter also into the glorious land. And I think almost everyone realizes that's talking about what is otherwise called the Holy Land, or the land of Palestine, what is presently called the land of Israel. And many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. And so it would seem then that those specific areas would escape the domination and the control of that beast power. And so some have thought, well, it must be in that particular area where God's people will go. Otherwise, you see, they would be right there under the thumb of that government, that resurrection of the Roman Empire. Now, in that area of ancient Edom, in particular, is this place called Petra, which we hear so much about from time to time. But there are many other remote areas. This is a very waste desert area, much of it, not all of it. You might be surprised to know that even a part of present-day Israel is in a part of ancient Edom. Not very much, but there is a little sliver of land, a little part of land that is part of the modern-day nation of Israel, which is in the ancient area of Edom. Now, if Petra is a place, if that is, quote, her place, there are certain texts that might be rather appropriate, and I would like to turn to them and try to cover them rather quickly. Let's turn first to Isaiah 42. And I would like to say ahead of time that some of these scriptures are rather ambiguous and may not mean exactly the way I say they may be understood. There may be other meanings, and maybe it isn't applying to what we're talking about. But quite possibly it is. Isaiah 42, verse 11. Let the wilderness and the cities thereof lift up their voice. And of course it's in the wilderness where her place is located. The villages that Kedar does inhabit. Let the inhabitants of the rock sing. Let them shout from the top of the mountains. Let them give glory unto the Eternal and declare his praise in the islands. Now the word rock here in English comes from the Hebrew word Selah, S-E-L-A. Now, there's another similar word which is not related, Selah, S-E-L-A-H. You'll find that frequently in the book of Psalms and also in the book of Habakkuk. But that's a different word, has a different meaning. The word Selah, S-E-L-A. Now, in the word, that word in Hebrew is generally translated rock, and it means a huge crag or a huge rock. The same word, translated into Greek, is Petra, P-E-T-R-A. Now, I haven't time to elaborate and compare that with the name Peter, but there is an interesting comparison there. But again, it means the same thing. It means a huge rock. And the place, the geographical place called Petra, is, I suppose, named that because of the huge rocks that are there. The sandstone, I believe, sort of a soft rock, but it's a huge rocky area, and a rather spectacular and a beautiful area, as far as that's concerned. And here, the word rock comes from the word Selah. And so if you wanted, you could translate the word rock into the Greek equivalent and say, let the inhabitants of Petra sing. Now that doesn't mean that that is the place that it has reference to. There are other rocks in other places besides the geographical place called Petra. Now Isaiah 33. Isaiah 33, verse 13. Hear you that are far off what I have done, and you that are near acknowledge my might. The sinners in Zion are afraid. Fearfulness has surprised the hypocrites. Who among us shall dwell with the devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burning? And it answers, he that walks righteously rather, and speaks uprightly, he that despises the gain of oppression, that shakes his hands from holding of bribes, that stops his ears from hearing of blood, and shuts his eyes from seeing evil. He shall dwell on high. That is speaking of the person he's describing now in verse 15. He shall dwell on high, or in the heights or the high places. His place of defense shall be the munitions of rocks. Bread shall be given him, his waters shall be sure. Now the words here, munitions of rocks, might better be translated strongholds of Selah, and could just as well be translated that way. Not munitions, but strongholds. So let's read it that way. He shall dwell on high. His place of defense shall be the strongholds of Selah. Bread shall be given him, and this might be very significant if this is what it's talking about. His water shall be sure, which is also very significant in what maybe we'll read a little bit later, or hear about a little bit later. Thine eyes shall see the king in his beauty. They shall behold the Lamb that is very far off, and so on and so forth. Now Isaiah 16. Isaiah 16. And this particular scripture is able to be understood in more than one way, and more than the way that I'm going to tell you about now. Send you the Lamb to the ruler of the land from Selah or Petra, and my margin even says Petra, to the wilderness, unto the mount of the daughters of Zion. For it shall be that as a wandering bird cast out with a nest, so the daughters of Moab shall be at the fords of Arnon. Take counsel, execute judgment, make your shadow as a night, in the midst of the noonday, hide the outcasts. You might notice that particular word outcast, and I'll have something to say about that later. Bewray not him that wanders. Let my outcast, God now is speaking about his outcasts, dwell with you, with Moab. Be you a cover or a cover to them from the face of the spoiler, for the extortioner is at an end. The spoiler ceases. The oppressors are consumed out of the land, and so on and so forth. Now, possibly that's referring to protection by the area of Moab, which is in the same general area. Edom and Moab were ancient neighbors, and they're not exactly in the same place, but they're neighbors to each other. Now, to Psalm 108. Psalm 108. Verse 10. Who will bring me into the strong city? Now the word here, strong city, if you look, I believe, in the Hebrew, you'll find that it's talking about Petra or Selah. Selah in the Hebrew. Who will bring me to Selah? Who will bring me to Petra? Who will lead me into Edom? And then he says, of course, God will do that and so on. Maybe this then is talking about the same thing, of God's people going to Selah or Petra. Now, if her place is Petra, and I'm not saying that it is, but if it isn't, I don't think the Bible gives us much of a clue as to where it might be. If it is Petra, it's certainly a very inhospitable place. And maybe one of the most inhospitable places on the face of the earth. Some people think, well, we'll probably go there because it's impregnable. Well, it's not at all impregnable. In the first place, not even by foot. It's surrounded by mountains, and there is a place called a Siq, S-I-Q, which is a narrow way, in some places only 6 or 12 feet wide, and almost vertical cliffs on both sides. And some think, well, you go in that way, and therefore it would be easy to defend. But you see, it's surrounded on all the other sides by mountains, and not impassable mountains at that. It's not impregnable. There's no water there. Did you hear that? There's no water there. Now, one time there's a spring, but I think commonly it's dry. There's no food there. There are no facilities there, except for a hotel. I used to have 6 or 7 rooms, something like that. I don't think that would go very far. It's very, very, maybe I should say very again, primitive. And if you think you're roughing it when you go camping or you go to Big Sandy, you ought to go to Petra. You say, oh, they have a lot of caves there. Yes, they do. And those caves were built or dug millennia ago. And they are filthy with human and animal waste of millennia. Now, maybe we'll be cleaning them out. I don't know. But if you think that's Cloud 9, or if you think that that's going to be a beautiful, wonderful place to go to, and if you do go there, I think you'll find that it's everything opposite to that. I'd like to refer to some articles that we have published quite some years past in the Good News that relate to this. And the first one was Mr. Norman Smith's article after he had visited there. And guess what the title was? We fled Petra. You'll find that in the October-November issue of 1966 Good News. Mr. David John Hill wrote an article on Petra, and both of these have pictures of Petra. Mr. Hill wrote one in October of 63, the October 63 Good News. And lest you think I don't know anything about the subject, I wrote an article on the subject in January of 1962. believe it or not, 17 years ago, January of 1962, I wrote an article on the subject. You may not escape the tribulation. Maybe some of you think I don't know much about the subject, but I've studied it a little bit. Now, if Petra is her place, Petra would not be the kingdom of God on earth. It wouldn't be heaven. It wouldn't be paradise. And if that's the place, and if you and I go there, it may be the greatest trial of our life. Now, some people have called this a place of safety. Is it a place of safety? We saw that it is going to be safe as far as Satan is concerned. And if that's what you mean by safety, I guess it is. But being in such a place may not be safety at all for some people. I think some think if I can just make it there, I've got it made. Well, I've got news for you. You know, it's not the one who endures to Petra or wherever it is. It's the one that endures to the end. And you'd have 3.5 more years. And an awful lot can happen in 3.5 years. Yes, it's those who endure to the end, not to Petra or those who endure to a place of safety that are going to be saved. It's those who endure to the end, Some may get to that place, wherever it is, and then fall away, because you can still sin. Not until you're given immortality are you not going to be able to sin any longer. So you can still sin, you can still rebel against God. Do you realize that people are going to have to learn to live together in harmony for 1,260 days, 24 hours a day, and at peace? And some of us can't live at peace with each other. And some of us have to go to different congregations of the Worldwide Church of God in Houston because we can't get along with each other. And some of us husbands and wives can't get along with each other for 24 hours. How are we going to do it for 1,260 days? Some may get sick, wherever that place is. They might get injured, and they might even die. So if you think that's a place of safety, I guess that depends on what your definition of a place of safety is. You'll be safe from some things, but it might be your greatest trial. Now, how will the church go to this place? We saw that it was on 2 wings of a great eagle. Oh, that means Boeing 747s for sure. We're just going to swoop down there and land in Petra and forever be with the Lord. Well, I'll have to disappoint you, because as far as I was able to find out in my research here a few years ago, there's only been one little airplane that was able to land there. Just one. Because it's a very rugged area. And as far as I've been able to find out, there's no major airport nearby. Now, you might land at Cairo, you might land, I was going to say Jerusalem, but I'm sure you couldn't there. You could maybe at Tel Aviv, and it's a long trek over to Petra. A very, very long one from either of those places. Or maybe from someplace in the Sinai. Maybe they've got some military airports over there, which they do, that could accommodate large aircraft. I'd like to read Exodus 19. Now, we read a little bit from Exodus 20 earlier. Let's go back to Exodus 19, the chapter before that. I'll throw a monkey wrench into the fire here, or into the works, rather. For those of you who think that God's going to take you, from your home over to Petra in a 747 or whatever you would like to go on. Exodus 19, verse 4. You have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, how I bare you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. And if you want to find out how they got there, read the book of Exodus, on the book of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, more particularly Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And you'll find out how they got there. They were born on eagle's wings. Now, whether that's what God is talking about over in Revelation 12, I'm not going to say. But lest you get your plans all made and go out and buy your tickets, I just want to warn you that may not be what God has in mind. Now, some have speculated that the church will be forced to go to this place, whatever that place is, that will be thrust out, that will be outcast. And one scripture made reference to that it could be a place of banishment, a place of exile, or even of execution. It could be that God's people will be sent to such a place, and those governments who would send them think they were sending them there for, final extermination or whatever, just like they did in Auschwitz and Buchenwald and other places in Germany. If so, we're not going to have any choice in the matter. You won't have to make any physical preparations. If you're in God's church and you're one of those, then that'll all be taken care of by somebody else. It'll be out of your hands. Now, others think that the church leadership will know what to do when the time comes. That reminds me of what Eusebius said about the church in that particular time when they were going to go to Pella, that the leadership of the church knew by prophecy what to do. If so, and I'm not going to say which it is, there's speculations on both sides. If so, probably some people will decide that it's too early when the church or Mr. Armstrong says we're going to do this, that, or the other thing. Some will say, well, it's too early. Some will say it's too late. Some will say it's the wrong place. Or some will say it's the wrong way to get there. And they won't go. Now, whatever happens, brethren, it's probably going to be a time of great trauma in the church, and for that matter in the world. A time of confusion, a time of turmoil, and I'm not just talking about the world, I'm talking about in the church. A time of uncertainty, a time of sadness, and especially personal sadness, of great conflict of mind, realizing that those who do go are going to be leaving loved ones who were not accounted worthy, loved ones who were not converted, loved ones that may not know anything about the church of God. And whether they're relatives, neighbors, whoever, all that will have to be left behind. All personal possessions will have to be left behind. Your job, your home, the comforts of home. And also with the knowledge that those remaining loved ones will have to go through the greatest time of trouble that this earth has ever seen. And that by itself is almost a tribulation, I think, for God's people. Brethren, such a venture, which some look forward to with such great anticipation, is not going to be any joyous picnic or holiday. Wherever it is, it's going to be a place where the church will be nourished, that will be fed physically and spiritually, as we read, for 1,260 days. It's been very aptly called, I think, by Mr. Waterhouse, Gerald Waterhouse, a place of final training. And I like that so much better than a place of safety. But a place of final training implies a lot of previous training. And some of us aren't getting very much previous training. Why is it that the people in God's church are so anxious, so curious about this subject? In too many cases, we're just looking for a fire escape, as I said. A way to save our own skin, trying to save our own life. You remember, we're supposed to give our lives. Now, the important lesson that I would like to leave you with, brethren, in all of this is this: that you do the job that God has given you to do, and do it to the best of your ability. Get close to God spiritually and stay there. Forget about trying to save your own neck. Concentrate on trying to save the world God's way. And I believe if you do those things, God will provide whatever is necessary. He will protect such people from the horrible tribulation that is going to soon come. As I said earlier, I had decided to give this sermon before I knew I was going to be leaving, and maybe it's not entirely an appropriate subject for a final sermon, and yet from another point of view, maybe it is. I don't know. But anyway, I'd been thinking about it for quite some time now, and been doing a little research, a little reading in connection with it. But I'd like to leave some parting words, aside from the sermon, parting words of exhortation, because as you have heard, we're going to be leaving Houston now. We've been here about 2.5 years. My wife and I have tried to set the right personal example before you. I have tried to preach the Word and not to preach my own ideas or the ideas of others. I've tried, and my wife has tried to help those who needed help and who wanted it. I hope that we have succeeded in helping some of you towards God's kingdom. But let me warn you of certain dangers that I've seen in this church, and not only in this church, but in others as well. One of the main things I'd like to tell you about is, or shall I say exhort you to do, is to look to Mr. Herbert Armstrong as the leader of God's church under Jesus Christ, no matter what happens, no matter what accusations you may hear. Now, there have been a lot of accusations, especially in recent weeks and months and years, about Mr. Armstrong and certain leadership of the church. Some of that's coming out and it's being cleaned out and cleared out. And some people who have wrong attitudes about this are gone or no longer with us, and I suppose others will leave, as far as that's concerned. But he is the one that God has used to raise up this end-time work. And until God removes him from that office, and very obviously does that, you had better follow him as he follows Jesus Christ. And if God removes him from his office, that's going to be very evident. And it won't be because somebody says he's senile, or because he's this, or because he's that, or he isn't something else. Follow him as he follows Christ. And if he tells you, break God's law, don't you do that. And I'm very confident he won't do that. But you follow him, you look to him as the leader of God's church under Jesus Christ, unless or until God removes him. Now, on another matter, some of you have listened to my sermons over the last 2.5 years, and maybe I was like a pleasant song to you, or playing an instrument, and you've done nothing about it. I've had sermons on family relations. I had a series on that subject, and some of you are failing miserably, and I know it, you know it, and maybe some others know it as well. Some of you have lost your love, your outgoing concern for your spouse. Some of you husbands are dictators. You're not loving, you're not providing for your wives as Christ has for his church. And you haven't shown that love to your wives that Christ has for his church. I know we can't measure up to him, but we can sure try, and we can sure work that direction. And we can do an awful, awful lot better. And some of the wives here have lost respect and love for their husbands. Some of you are alcoholics, and either won't do anything about it or will not admit it. Some of you are smoking. Some of you are lying. Some of you are committing adultery. Some of you use foul language. Some of you are worshiping the medical profession. Some of you have bad, disrespectful attitudes about others and about the leadership in the church, and particularly the last one. And brethren, you can't fool God. You can't play games with him. And so all I can say, brethren, is that if you are guilty of these things or any other thing, and I'm sure there are many others, you had better change. Or the time will come when God will say, that's enough. Hew that tree down. Brethren, I hope that these words will encourage you to grow and to overcome, and so that all of us, and me especially, that we'll all be in the kingdom of God and we can meet there.
Okay, absolutely very helpful, fabulous sermon, would you not say, brethren? Well, we're a little over time. I'm going to sign us off. I'm planning to come back on our webpage at cogtv.org at 6 o'clock tonight, Eastern Time. That'll be 5 Central Time. That'll be 3 p.m. Pacific Time. I know that'll be after the Sabbath in the UK and in Israel, but we're going to come back for those of you in the United States only on cogtv.org, sabbath.tv, 6 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. And I think Mr. Neff clarified himself, even though he presented some things as if he were knocking them. He was just, brethren, wanting you to think and assume nothing, prove all things. And yet even some of the things that he knocked, and even saying that, look, if Mr. Armstrong got off the boat, and told you to do something contrary to God's law, don't do it. God would remove him. But we know that Mr. Armstrong died in the faith and is still someone, even from the grave, we look to his words that he left as doctrine in the church, which in every case the Bible backs up and supports. So you can even prove the apostles' words as true for those who have God's Spirit, where you can understand. Brother, thank you for being with me today. I hope the rest of the Sabbath is a good one. Again, if you missed last night's Bible study, we've got it in the archive. You can find the link to it on YouTube from our homepage at cogtv.org. You can get to that by typing sabbath.tv. Push the menu button for archive video. Look for last night's Bible study date. And we only went just a little bit over an hour. So... And we punched right to the point from the Bible study last night. If you missed that, I encourage you to see it. Even if you saw it, you might want to hear it again. And this was certainly a fabulous sermon. You might even want to listen to this one again. I'm going to be using excerpts from it. I plan to in the future, God willing. And because Mr. Neff has just a way of saying things I think is good. We're going to use him, and we're definitely going to be continuing to play directly from the horse's mouth, God's End Time Apostle Herbert Armstrong, as we go. Brethren, those of you that want to join me later, we will not be on Facebook, will not be on YouTube, we'll only be on cogtv.org, that again you can get to by typing sabbath.tv. We'll only be on that live stream window on our own homepage at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're out of time here, and I'm in a break between a viewing and a funeral. I'm going to race over to the funeral for one of our long-time elderly church members, Ann Harmon. I was able to meet her brothers and sisters at the viewing while we were playing the sermon, and I'm going to honor that saint at her funeral, which one of our longtime ministers in the Birmingham area will be conducting. In just a few minutes from now, I got to sign off and dash over there. Thanks for joining me, brethren. Happy rest of the Sabbath. I might even live stream that funeral if some of the family members say that'd be all right. I'll see if I can ask them. So that'll be. You might want to just check our webpage. If we do live stream it, it'll just show up in the live stream window on our homepage at cogtv.org in about an hour from now. Half hour to an hour from now. I got to get going. Y'all have a good Sabbath, and those that want to join me later, I'll see you on our webpage at cogtv.org, sabbath.tv at 6 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. Happy Sabbath, brethren. Thanks for joining me. Bye for now.